the terrifying Peppa Pig episode that never aired. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George discovered an old music box in Grandpa Pig's attic. The delicate ballerina inside slowly spun to a haunting melody that seemed to come from somewhere far away, beyond the tiny mechanism. Peppa pressed the keys again and again, mesmerized by the dancer's endless pirouettes. That night, the music continued to play despite the music box being closed. The melody drifted through the house like a ghostly whisper, growing louder with each passing hour. Mummy Pig found herself humming along without realizing it, her gaze becoming distant and glassy. By morning, something had changed in the Pig family home. The walls seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with the music emanating from the music box, and shadows moved in corners where no one stood. Peppa noticed that her reflection in the mirror was dancing even when she stood perfectly still. George tried to tell everyone about his strange dreams where the ballerina stepped out of the music box and beckoned him to follow her into a world made entirely of spinning music boxes. But when he opened his mouth, only the haunting melody escaped. Daddy Pig attempted to throw away the music box, but it kept reappearing on the mantelpiece with its lid open, the ballerina spinning faster than ever before. The melody grew more complex, adding new layers of sound that seemed impossible for such a simple mechanism to produce. The neighbors began to notice that the Pig family now moved differently, their steps matching the rhythm of invisible music. Mrs. Rabbit mentioned that when she looked through their windows, she saw them all dancing in perfect synchronization, with closed eyes and frozen smiles on their faces. Days passed, and the music box's influence spread beyond the house. Other families in the village began humming the same haunting melody, and their children begged for music boxes of their own. The toy shop owner reported that all the music boxes in his store had started playing the same tunes simultaneously. Peppa realized that the ballerina was not just decoration. She was collecting dancers for an eternal performance. Everyone who heard the melody in its entirety joined the dance, their souls trapped in an endless waltz that spanned all dimensions. The music box had waited in the attic for decades, patient and persistent, knowing that sooner or later curious children would find it and wind the key. Now, finally, the show could begin, with the entire village as its stage and every resident an unwilling participant in a dance that would never end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the windows, and everything seemed normal. But when Peppa looked over at George's bed, something was wrong. George was sitting up, but his eyes were completely black, like two dark holes in his green face. Peppa blinked and rubbed her eyes. When she looked again, George appeared normal, smiling his usual cheerful smile. He jumped out of bed and ran downstairs for breakfast, leaving Peppa confused and worried. In the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making pancakes. But when she turned around to greet the children, Peppa gasped. Her smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear, showing far too many sharp, pointed teeth that glinted in the morning light. Daddy Pig came into the kitchen, reading his newspaper. When he lowered the paper, his glasses reflected dark figures standing behind Peppa. But when she turned around, the kitchen was empty. The family decided to visit the playground after breakfast. As they walked through the town, everything looked normal from a distance. But Peppa noticed that all the windows were dark, even though she could hear voices and laughter coming from within. At the playground, Susie Sheep was playing on the swings. She waved at Peppa, but when Peppa waved back, she noticed that Susie's shadow was wrong. While Susie was swinging, her shadow remained perfectly still, as if it was watching Peppa. More friends arrived. Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and Candy Cat all came to play. But Peppa began to notice that whenever she wasn't looking directly at them, they would stop moving entirely, like dolls waiting for someone to play with them. When they played hide and seek, the children would hide in impossible places. Rebecca Rabbit disappeared into a tree that was too small. Pedro Pony vanished behind a swing set with no space behind it. As the sun began to set, Peppa's friends said goodbye and left with their families. But instead of walking away, they simply faded into the growing shadows, becoming part of the darkness spreading across the playground. When the family reached their house, it looked different. The yellow walls seemed duller, and the windows reflected something much darker. Inside, the programs on TV were wrong. The characters would look directly out of the screen. When bedtime came, everything felt routine and safe. But as the lights went out, Peppa heard something that made her freeze. From somewhere in the walls, she could hear the sound of other children playing. As Peppa lay in her bed, the sounds were getting closer. The invisible children were moving through the house, their games becoming louder. Slowly, Peppa began to understand that they weren't just playing games. The last thing Peppa remembered was the sound of her bedroom door slowly creaking open, even though no one was there. In the morning, Mummy and Daddy Pig found 2 empty beds. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide and seek in their house. The familiar yellow walls seemed brighter than usual, and the purple furniture cast strange shadows in the dim light. Peppa counted to 10 while George scurried away to find the perfect hiding spot. But when she opened her eyes, something felt different about their home. The living room looked exactly the same, yet somehow wrong. The orange sofa sat in its usual place, the television flickered with static, and the family pictures hung crooked on the green walls. Peppa called out for George, but her voice echoed strangely, as if the house had grown much larger than before. She walked through the familiar rooms, but each step seemed to take her further away from where she wanted to go. George was hiding in the toy chest upstairs, giggling quietly to himself. But as minutes passed, his laughter faded into worried silence. The house had become too quiet. Even the usual sounds of Mummy and Daddy Pig moving about downstairs had stopped completely. George peeked out from his hiding place and noticed that all the toys around him had turned to face the chest, their plastic eyes staring directly at him with unblinking intensity. Peppa searched every room, calling George's name with increasing desperation. The kitchen looked normal, but the refrigerator hummed a tune she had never heard before. The bathroom mirror reflected her image, but her reflection seemed to move just a fraction of a second too late. When she reached the stairs, she found that they stretched much higher than they should, disappearing into darkness above. Meanwhile, George tried to climb out of the Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their toy box. The toys were arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, as if they had been having a meeting while the children slept. Peppa laughed it off, but George noticed that his favorite dinosaur toy was missing its usual cheerful expression. Instead, its plastic eyes seemed to follow him around the room. During breakfast, Mummy Pig announced they would be visiting a new playground that had just opened in town. The family drove through winding roads that seemed to stretch longer than usual, passing the same tree 3 times before finally arriving. The playground was completely empty, which was odd for such a beautiful day. The swings moved gently in the breeze, even though there was no wind. As they explored the playground, Peppa noticed that all the equipment was slightly wrong. The slide was too steep, the monkey bars were too high, and the seesaw balanced perfectly even when no one was on it. George pointed to the sandbox, where tiny handprints appeared in the sand, forming a trail that led to nowhere. The handprints were too small to belong to any child they knew. Daddy Pig suggested they play hide and seek to lighten the mood. Peppa counted to 10 while everyone hid, but when she opened her eyes, the playground had changed. The bright colors had faded to muted grays and browns, and shadows stretched in impossible directions. She called out for her family, but her voice echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed by something unseen. Following the sound of George's giggling, Peppa found herself in a part of the playground she hadn't seen before. The equipment here was made of twisted metal and splintered wood, yet it looked brand new. George was sitting on a swing that moved by itself, his back turned to her. When he finally turned around, his usual smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a way that made Peppa's stomach feel funny. Mummy and Daddy Pig appeared from behind a structure that definitely hadn't been there moments before. They were smiling too, but their eyes remained completely still, never blinking. They spoke in perfect unison, suggesting they all play together forever and ever. The playground began to shift and change around them, with new equipment appearing and disappearing like a living maze. As the sun began to set, though it felt like they had only been there for minutes, Peppa realized that the exit they had used to enter was no longer there. Every path led deeper into the playground, and every game they played seemed to last exactly the same amount of time. The other families that began to arrive all had the same two wide smiles and unblinking eyes. The playground's music box melody started playing from speakers hidden throughout the area, a cheerful tune that became more distorted with each repetition. Peppa tried to wake up, thinking this must be a dream, but pinching herself.
Peppa Pig. The drawing that wasn't hers. It all started on an ordinary Sunday morning. The sun had just begun to filter through the curtains, and the room was quiet. Peppa stretched, jumped out of bed, and, as always, walked to her desk. She wanted to draw something for school, but there was already a sheet of paper on the table, perfectly drawn. In the center, the kitchen. She was standing there. George sat at the table. Daddy Pig was pouring tea. Mummy Pig was holding toast in her hoof. Everything looked familiar until one detail. A broken teacup lay on the floor, clearly drawn, with shards, even a drop of tea nearby. "I didn't draw this," whispered Peppa. She glanced around. George was still asleep. Her colored pencils were neatly packed in their box. The paper was clean, unwrinkled. No one could have faked her style, but the handwriting, it felt strangely familiar. At breakfast, she said nothing. She just remembered the scene. And everything happened exactly the same. Daddy Pig's exact words, "The morning starts with tea." Mummy's same smile, and the teacup slipping and shattering on the floor, just like in the drawing. "Coincidence," she mumbled, but her heart beat faster. The next morning, another page. It was already waiting on her desk. The scene, a walk in the yard, George with his ball, she had her kite, and in the background, a puddle she was about to fall into. She tried to avoid it, but everything happened just as in the drawing. Even George's shout was the same. The third drawing was worse. Their bedroom, nighttime, and next to George's bed, a figure, dark, vague, just a silhouette, sketched in soft pencil. Peppa stared at it for a long time. She wanted to tear it up, but her hand wouldn't move. "Who's doing this?" she asked the mirror. "Who's drawing?" That night, she couldn't sleep. She listened to every sound. At 2 a.m., George moaned. She got up, walked over, and saw a shadow at the door, exactly like the one in the drawing. It vanished the moment she blinked. This can't be real. Each day, the drawings got darker. One showed her standing alone, her family behind her, all with empty eyes, and above them, a message. "You didn't notice, but they've changed." She tried hiding the drawings, in a drawer, under the bed, even in the storage room. But every morning, a new sheet was on the table, always fresh, as if someone placed it there during the night. On the 7th day, she woke up early, waited, lay with her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, and heard it. The soft rustle of paper, a faint wooden creak. Someone was in the room, someone breathing quietly. She opened her eyes. No one there, just the new drawing. In it, herself, sitting at the desk, reading the very drawing she was holding. And behind her, a hand, long, drawn in black chalk. She was turning her head, and the drawing ended there. The final line trembled, as if the artist had been interrupted. Since then, Peppa can't sleep soundly. She's afraid not just of tomorrow morning, but of the one who already knows it, the one drawing her life, step by step, and coming closer, because the last drawing she saw was blank, just one silhouette, faceless, with a message below. "Your turn to draw."
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their cozy yellow house. The sun was shining through their bedroom window, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig was making breakfast downstairs, humming her usual cheerful tune. But something was different today, something that none of them could quite put their finger on. As Peppa brushed her teeth, she noticed her reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to lag behind her movements by just a fraction of a second. When she raised her hand, her reflection followed a moment later. When she smiled, her reflection's smile appeared slightly wider, showing just a few too many teeth. But when she blinked and looked again, everything appeared normal. During breakfast, George kept staring at his favorite dinosaur toy on the kitchen table. The green plastic dinosaur that usually brought him so much joy now seemed to be watching him back. Its painted eyes followed George as he moved around the kitchen, and when no one was looking, George could swear he saw the toy's mouth open and close silently, as if it was trying to say something important. Daddy Pig announced that today they would visit Grandpa Pig's farm, which usually made the children excited. But as they drove through the countryside, the familiar landscape began to change in subtle ways. The trees along the road grew taller and darker, their branches reaching toward the car like gnarled fingers. The cheerful yellow flowers in the fields turned pale and seemed to wilt as they passed by. When they arrived at the farm, Grandpa Pig greeted them with his usual warm smile, but his eyes seemed different somehow. They were darker than usual, almost black, and they never seemed to blink. He led them to see the animals, but the chickens were completely silent, standing motionless in perfect rows. The pigs in the pen had stopped their usual snorting and rolling in mud, instead standing perfectly still and staring at the family with unblinking eyes. The vegetable garden that Grandpa Pig was so proud of had grown overnight into something unrecognizable. The carrots had sprouted into twisted, gnarled shapes that looked more like tiny hands reaching up from the earth. The tomatoes had turned an unnaturally deep red, almost black, and seemed to pulse gently as if they had heartbeats of their own. As the afternoon wore on, more strange things began to happen. The family's shadows on the ground started moving independently, gesturing and pointing in directions that didn't match their owner's movements. When Peppa looked down at her shadow, it waved at her with both hands while she stood perfectly still. George's shadow seemed to be jumping up and down excitedly, even though George himself was sitting quietly on a hay bale. The sky began to change color as evening approached, but instead of the usual orange and pink sunset, it turned a sickly green color that made everyone's skin look pale and strange. The clouds formed shapes that looked almost like faces, watching the family from above with expressions that seemed both sad and hungry. When it was time to go home, the car wouldn't start. Daddy Pig turned the key again and again, but the engine remained silent. As they sat in the car wondering what to do, they noticed that all the farm animals had gathered around the vehicle, forming a perfect circle. The chickens, pigs, sheep, and even Grandpa Pig's old horse stood motionless, staring at the family through the car windows with those same dark, unblinking eyes. Grandpa Pig approached the car with that same strange smile, tapping gently on the window. When Daddy Pig rolled it down, Grandpa Pig leaned in close and whispered something that made all the adults go very quiet and pale. The children couldn't hear what he said, but they noticed that his breath smelled like old earth and forgotten things. Suddenly, the car engine roared to life on its own, and they drove away quickly. But as they looked back through the rear window, they could see Grandpa Pig and all the animals still standing in that perfect circle, watching them disappear into the distance. And in the growing darkness, it seemed like there were many more figures standing behind them, shapes that hadn't been there before. When they finally reached home, everything appeared normal again. The house was warm and bright, and Mummy Pig made them hot chocolate before bed. But that night, as Peppa and George lay in their beds, they could hear soft scratching sounds coming from inside the walls, as if something was trying to get in. And when they looked out their bedroom window, they could see dark shapes moving in the garden, shapes that looked almost like the animals from Grandpa Pig's farm, waiting patiently in the moonlight. The next morning, everything was back to normal, and the family never spoke about their strange day at the farm again. But sometimes, when Peppa looked in mirrors, she still noticed that her reflection smiled just a little too wide, showing just a few too many teeth.